Are you having a hard time figuring out what to get Dad for Father's Day? You should check out Row 1 Brand's Vintage Pictorum Gallery. They have America's best sports art. With over 7,200 historic sports prints, you're assured to find something unique for Dad this Father's Day. Instead of a boring old tie, get him a historic baseball photo taken by Henry High Sandom at the historic Polo Grounds Stadium in New York City during the 1894 Temple Cup. Or, if he's an NFL buff, check out the 1963 vintage NFL poster. These are so good looking that you'll be amazed how they turn out. Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1 and save 15% off your order.
This is Basketball History 101 with Rick Loayza.
Welcome back to Basketball History 101, part of the Sports History Network. I am your host, Rick Loayza, and this is the podcast where we bring to life some of the forgotten stories from basketball history. And today, we are going to talk about the time that nobody wanted Bob Cousy on their team. And I know that sounds weird, but it's true. If you know anything about basketball history, and I know that most of you do, then you know that Bob Cousy is a Hall of Fame point guard for the Celtics from the 1950s and 1960s. How could teams not want him? He is one of the NBA's 50 greatest players. There are few players who were as underrated as Cousy was when he was coming out of college in 1950. Let me just name his major accomplishments to give you an idea of how good he was. He played 13 seasons for the Celtics and made the All-Star game in all 13 of those seasons. He was league MVP in 1957. He led the league in assists 8 times, was named All-NBA 12 times, and he was the MVP of the All-Star game twice. He was inducted into the Basketball Hall of Fame in 1971. He was as good as it gets. So how did he go under the radar? You see, that's a weird story because he was one of the most exciting college players in the country. He played his college basketball at the College of the Holy Cross, located just outside of Boston. He dominated during his 4 years there. He increased his scoring average every year he was there, finishing with 19 points per game in his final year. His prowess as a dribbler packed the gym as he was the main attraction. He was probably the most popular point guard on the East Coast. So it wasn't like he was an unknown player. Everybody in the NBA knew who Bob Cousy was. And the Celtics had the inside track on getting Cousy if they wanted. Back then in the NBA, there was something called the Territorial Draft. And the Territorial Draft worked like this. Any NBA team could automatically claim one college player to be on their team, provided that the player's school was located within 75 miles of the NBA team's arena. Now, the team didn't have to exercise their claim, but if they did, then they would have to give up their first-round pick, because essentially, exercising the claim was their first-round pick. At the time, the NBA figured that the best way to increase ticket sales was to make sure that college stars played for the NBA teams located in the same area as their school. Therefore, it means that any superstar coming out of a school in the Boston area would be on the Celtics, and that any superstar coming out of the New York City area would end up on the Knicks. The thinking was that the fans of the player could be brought over to continue rooting for their player in the NBA. See, this was a time when college basketball was still far more popular than the NBA, so the rule made sense from a business perspective. Since Cousy went to college in the Boston area, the Celtics could have just claimed him using the Territorial Draft. But Red Auerbach, the coach and general manager of the Celtics, did not want Cousy. Despite public pressure to claim Cousy, Auerbach had his sights on a player from Bowling Green University in Ohio. Here is what Auerbach said at the time in regard to Cousy, quote, "The only thing that counts for me is ability, and Cousy hasn't proven to me that he's got that ability. I'm not interested in bringing someone in just because he's a local yokel. That won't bring in more than a dozen people into the building on a regular basis. What will bring fans in is a winning team, and that's what I want to have." Unquote. Those are pretty strong words from Auerbach in regard to Cousy. But I have to give Auerbach credit because he was right about one thing. Throughout sports history, the best way to bring in fans and make a profit is to put a winning team out there. It doesn't matter who's on the team. That same year in 1950, the Philadelphia Warriors used their territorial pick to take Paul Arizin from Villanova University. Arizin would go on to have a Hall of Fame career, so that worked out pretty well for them. So all the territorial picks go first, and then they begin the regular first round of the draft for the teams that did not use a territorial pick. And the Celtics had the first pick in the draft, and Auerbach took a player named Chuck Scher from Bowling Green University, the one that I had mentioned before. That was the player that Auerbach really wanted, and he got him. But Scher would never play for the Celtics. He would play 9 seasons in the NBA for the Pistons, Hawks, and the Lakers with a career average of 8 points per game. Cousy was drafted with the 3rd pick in the first round by the Tri-Cities Blackhawks. Now, Tri-Cities is known as the Atlanta Hawks today, by the way. But the Blackhawks didn't really want Cousy either, even though they drafted him. What they did was they immediately traded Cousy to the Chicago Stags in exchange for a player named Flash Bryan, who had just completed a very successful rookie year. But Bryan only played 6 seasons in the NBA. He made the All-Star game twice and finished with a career average of 12 points per game. Now, do you see where I'm going with this story? Even the Blackhawks didn't really want Cousy. They only drafted him so they could use him in a trade with the Stags for the player that they really wanted. So now, Cousy is on the Chicago Stags, at least on paper. And the Stags are not that interested in Cousy either, even though they just traded for him. You see, back then, NBA salaries were not what they are today, and I've mentioned this before in previous episodes, that salaries back in the 40s and 50s and even into the very early 1960s were not what they are today. So it was not a given that Cousy would even play in the NBA. He earned his degree in business from Holy Cross and was seriously considering entering the corporate world for a very simple reason. He had an offer from a Boston company that would have paid him even more money than what anybody in the NBA was offering. Can you imagine that today? Imagine that LaMelo Ball, who was this last season's 3rd pick by the Charlotte Hornets, imagine that he decided to take a job as an accountant because it paid him more than what the Hornets were offering. But that's exactly the position Cousy was in, and every NBA team knew it. He became nothing more than trade bait. You see, he was a risk. It was no guarantee that he would even come to the NBA, so who wants to waste their time or waste a pick on a player who may not even play for you? But the Stags weren't quite sure what to actually do with Cousy. They didn't really want him, so they were kind of in a quandary. Should they try to sign him or trade him to someone else? But the Stags also had a bigger problem than what to do with Cousy. They were teetering financially and were trying to figure out ways to stay in business. Very quickly, all of the business with Cousy became moot when the Stags had to fold and go out of business. At this point, the NBA had to step in. A few other teams had also gone out of business at the same time, and something had to be done with all of these player contracts. The NBA had a dispersal draft, where all of these players from the defunct teams would be reassigned to existing teams. Now, the teams that were still in business went after the very best players from these other teams that had to close their doors. And that is a good place to take a break, and I'll share more of the story right after this.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Welcome back to the show, and let's continue with the story of how nobody wanted Bob Cousy. We left off with the Chicago Stags going out of business and the NBA needing to reassign Cousy to another team in the NBA that had not gone out of business. So, to make a long story short, the Celtics ended up with Cousy, but Auerbach still didn't want him. He thought that Cousy was just too short at 6'1" or 185 centimeters. But Cousy finally came around on giving NBA basketball a shot. He figured that he could always go into business, but he only had a short window to play professional basketball. So Cousy and Auerbach worked out a contract and brought Cousy onto the Celtics. The way that Auerbach figured it, Cousy was already there, so you might as well give him a chance and see how he plays with the other professionals. I'll say this about Auerbach, he could be very stubborn in many areas, and he irritated pretty much every other coach in the league, but when it came to the game of basketball, he had no problem adopting somebody else's idea if it helped make his team better. And once he saw Cousy in practice, he realized that he had massively misjudged Cousy. He was an excellent point guard, and the entire Celtics offense ran way more smoothly when Cousy was running it. It was obvious to Auerbach that Cousy should be the new point guard for the Boston Celtics. And as I mentioned earlier, he made the All-Star team in his rookie season. So even the rest of the league realized that this kid from Holy Cross University could really play ball. I mean, how often have we seen NBA teams draft players who turned out to be just awful? On the other hand, there are many players who were drafted later or not drafted at all and became all-star players. Just last week, it was announced that Ben Wallace made it to the Hall of Fame. He is the first undrafted player to become a Hall of Famer. So the lesson here is you just never know who is going to have success and who is going to disappear. In many cases, it seems like the teams are just rolling the dice and hoping the players they draft turn out to be contributors to the team. So, that's our story for today. That's the story of how nobody wanted Bob Cousy. Of course, if they had to redo the 1950 draft, well, if I'm being honest, it's probably Paul Arizin that still goes first. I mean, he was a Hall of Famer in his own right and an amazing scorer, but Bob Cousy would have definitely gone next. He was an absolutely transformative player. And once he got paired with Bill Russell, the sky was the limit. So that's it for our story for today. Join us next time when I bring you the story of Don Barksdale. He repeatedly broke color barriers at nearly every level of basketball, from college to the Olympics and to the NBA. That's next time on Basketball History 101, part of the Sports History Network, the headquarters of Sports Yesteryear. Go to sportshistorynetwork.com to find out more about this and other sports history podcasts. If you like what you hear, please hit that subscribe button wherever you get your podcast. Also, go ahead and give us a rating and a review, and that will help others to find this podcast more easily. And check out our page on Facebook. It's called Basketball History 101 Podcast. There you will find shorter historical posts as well as comments and discussion starters on today's game. And I'll also announce there when new episodes come out. I want to thank my producer and editor, Jacob Loayza. Join us each week as we continue to mine the history of basketball for more great stories from the past. Take care, and see you soon.
We here at the Sports History Network proudly partner with 26 podcasts, all revolving around the history of sports. But did you know that many of our hosts were sports history authors way before they started their shows? It's true. We've got Joe Ziemba, host of When Football Was Football, Joe Zagurski, host of Pro Football in the 1970s, Mark Morthier, host of Yesterday Sports, Tommy Phillips, host of Lombardi Memories, and Scott Adamson, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line. All these authors have many books for you to choose from. To check them out, go to our website at sportshistorynetwork.com/sportshistorybooks. Pick up your copy today. Soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of filmmusic.io.